If you have ever watched videos about São Paulo, or have even been there yourself, then you know that it is a city that literally breathes life. It hums around the clock, traffic jams, lights, markets, offices, universities. Everything blends into one enormous living organism that never sleeps. But in the late 1990s, it was here, in one of the most densely populated megacities in the world, that something began to happen that no one could have expected. Young women started disappearing quietly, almost unnoticed, as if the earth itself had swallowed them. They would leave for a meeting, for work, for a casting call. They would tell someone they would send a message, or be back in an hour, and then they were never seen again. At first, no one even connected these cases. The city was huge, disappearances happened all the time, and the police were overwhelmed. Families kept hearing the same thing: wait 48 hours, maybe she simply left, maybe she turned off her phone. But the families knew that something was wrong. These women did not just vanish for no reason. They had plans, jobs, friends. And most importantly, each of them had left home calm and unsuspecting, as if it were an ordinary day. And after that it was as though they had dissolved into thin air. Only months later did it become clear that all the threads led to one place, the São Paulo State Park, a vast green expanse in the middle of the metropolis. Almost like the story of Moscow's Bitsevsky Park. It is an enormous area where forests, walking trails, deserted zones, and dense undergrowth turn an urban park into a true labyrinth. People came there to jog, ride bicycles, and relax. No one imagined that this was exactly where something was taking shape that would later become one of the loudest and most horrifying criminal cases in the history of Brazil. But before telling what exactly was happening in the park, it is important to understand the man who stood at the center of this story. For a long time, his name meant nothing even to Brazilians. He was not a legendary serial criminal, not a repeat offender, not a man with a long criminal record. On the contrary, his background seemed completely inconsistent with that kind of profile. Francisco Pereira at first glance. He looked like an ordinary man in his early 30s, attractive, talkative, slightly short, athletic, open in conversation. He knew how to make a good impression from the very first minute. He knew how to listen. He knew how to ask questions in a way that made the other person feel important. Those who met him back then said much the same thing: nothing unusual, pleasant, charming, not someone who looked like a criminal. And perhaps that was exactly what made him so dangerous. In general, this trait is characteristic of many serial killers. In everyday life, Francisco worked as a motorcycle courier, one of the most common jobs in São Paulo. But there was one detail that would later play a huge role. He was interested in photography. Or rather, he presented himself as someone who worked in photography. He knew the basic terminology, could talk about lighting, angles, and posing just enough to make an impression, especially on young women dreaming of a modeling career. And in the late 1990s, the dream of becoming a model in Brazil was a powerful one for many girls. Adriana Lima's rise was happening around that same time. Young women saw their peers becoming global stars and believed that everyone had a chance. All it took was that one magical connection, that one casting call, that one successful photo, and life could change completely. Francisco understood this perfectly. His strategy was simple and highly polished. He approached young women in shopping malls, near bus stops, in cafes, on the streets, in other words. In crowded public places where no one would reasonably expect danger, he said that he worked with a well-known magazine and promised them a casting opportunity. And most importantly, he never pressured them. He did not behave aggressively. He was polite and composed. Everything happened gently, and an easy, casual tone. The young woman would agree to the meeting on her own, believe him on her own, and then go herself to what would become a fatal photo session. That was what set him apart from many other criminals. There was no crude force, only psychological manipulation, and what mattered most was that his story sounded believable. In the 1990s, there were no social networks where you could check who a person really was. There were no platforms where you could verify whether he actually worked for an agency. The mere fact that he had a professional camera was already a convincing enough argument, and when a young woman agreed to the casting, he suggested a location that, according to him, offered perfect natural light: São Paulo State Park. A vast area where beautiful nature shots could be taken, a city park full of people, full of families, athletes, and walkers, safe but only at first glance. Francisco knew how to choose the moment when the flow of people began to thin out. Some were leaving after a run, others were heading home. And deep inside the park only a few visitors remained. He led his victims farther away from the main paths, farther from the cycling areas, into places where the vegetation grew denser and the silence became more unsettling. And the most terrifying part was that even when the first reports of missing young women began to appear, no one connected it to the park. It seemed impossible that, amid the daytime noise of São Paulo, someone could use an open public place to hunt for victims. But that was exactly what was happening. By the end of 1998, the number of missing women had increased so much that it became obvious something systematic was taking place. And law enforcement had to acknowledge the presence of a serial predator. The stories were too similar, the profiles of the young women too alike, the routes too identical. And it was at that moment that a name first entered the picture, one that would later become known throughout the entire country: Francisco Pereira. But how did the police get to him? What exactly did investigators find? And why did his methods later become the subject of numerous criminological studies, while the public still did not grasp the full scale of what was happening? A growing sense of alarm was beginning to take hold inside the São Paulo police. Again and again, reports began to surface from women who had survived attacks but had managed to escape. Their testimonies were strikingly similar, down to the smallest details, so similar, in fact, that investigators realized this was not a set of isolated cases, it was a series, and behind it stood one and the same man. Several victims said that the man introduced himself as a photographer, sometimes as a casting agent, sometimes as an employee of an advertising agency looking for young women for photo shoots. He spoke softly, confidently, and politely. He never raised his voice, never gave the impression of danger. On the contrary, he inspired trust. He knew how to present himself: a smile, calmness, confidence, neat clothing, a briefcase supposedly containing scripts and contracts. One young woman later said, "He spoke so calmly and confidently that it never even occurred to me to think anything bad." That was the key point. He did not attack suddenly, he built trust. Sometimes over the course of several hours, before finally suggesting that they take test photos in the park, where there was more natural light and fewer people. So the model would not feel embarrassed. The police tried to piece together an initial mosaic from the testimonies, and little by little a profile of the offender began to emerge. Surprisingly, he was not an obvious outcast or drifter. And that was precisely why it was so difficult to believe that behind this mask stood one of the most brutal criminals of the 1990s in Brazil. At the same time, the police began to produce the first composite sketches. They were still very vague, but certain common features could be seen from one to another. They resembled each other and, strikingly, they resembled an ordinary man of average height with a familiar face, the kind of appearance you would forget within 5 minutes. And that was yet another factor working in his favor. He was invisible in the crowd, just like thousands of others on the streets of São Paulo. The same was true of figures like Chikatilo, Anatoly Slivko, and Sergei Golovkin. They too were outwardly gray, inconspicuous people in society. Meanwhile, the media began to fuel both public interest and growing panic. Journalists learned about the series of attacks before the police were able to prepare an official statement. And the first sensational label appeared: the Park Maniac. The name caught on quickly. People became afraid to walk through the park alone. Young women were warned by friends, acquaintances, and neighbors. But the danger was that the offender never hunted in exactly the same place for too long. He operated mainly within that area, but he knew the city well and knew how to disappear into it. Investigators began studying the routes of the attacks and noticed something important. Many victims said that he seemed extremely confident in his surroundings. He knew the hidden paths, knew where the security guards usually passed, which areas were the least crowded, where it was possible to catch a taxi, and where it was better to leave on foot so as not to be noticed. This suggested that he was local, lived nearby, or had been in that part of the city dozens of times. And all this time, Francisco continued his crimes. His strategy was precise and refined to choose a target, usually a young woman, sometimes a student, sometimes a girl who had come for a job interview, draw her in with an offer of modeling work. Slowly and gently build trust, lead her into the park under the pretext of a trial photo shoot, and then wait for the moment when no one was nearby. This pattern repeated itself again and again, but then, as so often happens in stories about serial offenders, chance intervened. A mistake by the criminal, a lapse in caution, and suddenly the whole case began to open up. One of the women who survived an attack managed to escape. She was in shock, but she was still able to describe not only the attacker's appearance, but also his manner of speaking, his gestures, his clothing, and the way he persuaded people. This was the first truly valuable description, a psychological one. She said that he was astonishingly calm and seemed to control everything around him, and this matched the testimony of two other women who had also survived. The police understood that they were not dealing with an impulsive criminal, but with a man who had a clear method, discipline, and a strong ability to manipulate. The first large-scale operation began. Officers combed through the park, set up surveillance, and photographed suspicious men, but the city was enormous, the park was vast, and the predator was experienced. He noticed patrols long before they came close to his area. That period became a turning point. The number of disappearances began to rise, and the newspapers started publishing even more alarming headlines. The public began demanding decisive action from the authorities, and when the first bodies were found, investigators realized that the scale of the series was far greater than they had originally thought. It was at that moment that the name first began to be heard, the one that the whole country would soon know: Francisco Pereira. After the first reports of missing young women, an uneasy silence settled over the São Paulo Security Department. Officially, nothing too serious. Internally, a growing sense of alarm. The police could see it: young women were disappearing along the same routes, in the same area, and with roughly similar physical characteristics. But this was 1998. No one was yet ready to openly use the word serial killer. In Brazil, cases like that were approached with particular caution. It was too horrifying a prospect for such a densely populated country, and for such a massive city. And then the first common details began to surface. Relatives of several missing women told almost exactly the same story before disappearing. The women had been called or contacted by a man with a pleasant voice. He introduced himself as a photographer, a modeling agency manager, an advertising employee, sometimes even an assistant to a well-known brand. He promised them participation in photo shoots, a free portfolio, or a chance to enter the modeling industry. What struck investigators later was his politeness. He was never overly pushy, and considering that São Paulo was the largest fashion hub in Latin America, an offer of a free photo shoot sounded entirely plausible, tempting, yet at the same time dangerous. One of the women who would later play a key role in the case was a young woman named Vanessa, one of the very few who managed to survive. She said that the man behaved so naturally that, in the first minutes of talking to him, she did not even truly perceive him as a stranger. He walked beside her, gestured toward the trees, made light jokes, and assured her that the photo session would be just a few minutes' walk away, in a place with the best light. And only when they had gone deeper into the park did she notice a change in his behavior. The words "he suddenly changed" were repeated by many different women who later gave testimony. At first he was gentle, polite, and charming. Then, within minutes, there was silence, abrupt movements, and a completely different look in his eyes. It was as if the person standing in front of them had switched off, and someone else had appeared in his place. But at the beginning of the investigation, the police had neither the full picture nor a suspect. They did not even know that it was the same man. Each case involving a missing young woman was handled by different departments and different investigators. And at that time, there was simply no centralized database or rapid system for cross-checking information. Everything changed only when the first survivor appeared and decided to describe the man in detail. She did not just give a statement, she provided a full portrait. She described the way he spoke, the familiar psychological techniques he used, and the way he convinced her that they absolutely needed to walk a little farther. And just a few days later, a second survivor appeared. She did not know the first woman, they had never spoken, and they could not have exchanged information. But she described almost exactly the same thing, from the way he smiled to the peculiarity of his walk. That was when the police officially recognized for the first time that they were dealing with one and the same man. But the most remarkable part came later. Investigators returned to the places where the women had last been seen. Until then, each section of the park had been examined as a separate location. But once they began comparing the data, it became clear the offender was not simply choosing secluded areas, but places with specific visual cover: natural bends in the trail, turns, bamboo thickets, and sections where the noise of the city was completely muffled. Places where no one would wander by. This became the first major forensic clue. The person who brought the women there either knew the park like the back of his hand, or had spent a great deal of time in it, so much time that he had studied its shadows, its acoustics, and its roots. After that, the police began searching the park differently, as the territory in which one and the same man was operating, not as a collection of random points. And then, to the horror of the investigators, they began finding numerous bodies. From that moment on, the investigation moved in a completely different direction. There was no doubt left. The offender acted systematically, in the same way, following a carefully practiced method. Investigators already understood that such a person did not act spontaneously. He was confident in his abilities. He knew how to disappear without being noticed. And most importantly, he had done this more than once. That meant he would either continue or was already seeking a new victim. But the most terrifying part at that moment was something else entirely. The police still did not know what he looked like. Before we move on to the final, most chilling part of this story, let me remind you, if you enjoy this kind of deep dive investigation into rare criminal cases or little-known stories, be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your reactions help me find new material, analyze the most complex cases, and release even more rich, detailed content. Now, back to our story. When investigators finally began systematically connecting witness statements to the behavior of the killer himself, it became clear that the case was far more complex than it initially seemed. The public demanded to understand how a man, without exceptional intelligence, without access to resources, and without influential connections, could hunt for so long in the city center and remain virtually invisible. The police faced heavy criticism. Everything seemed to come down to a strange, yet very Brazilian factor: the urban chaos of São Paulo. The park was enormous, dense, with countless trails, hidden sections, abandoned rotundas, and concealed approaches. In such places, it was easy to vanish for a few minutes and then reappear as if nothing had happened. And above all, constant noise, crowds of people, and thousands of faces that nobody ever remembered. But when Pereira was arrested and interrogated, it became clear that the story wasn't just about the urban environment. He had mastered the art of manipulating the fears and dreams of his victims. He knew how to speak in a way that made a young woman feel special, and in turn, he carefully observed and measured her reactions. Investigators recall that in the first hours of questioning, Pereira appeared calm and relaxed, as if he had been brought in not for a series of murders, but for some trivial misunderstanding. He even joked, winked at the cameras, and tried to charm the investigators. Psychologists later said this was characteristic of people with pronounced narcissistic traits. He loved being the center of attention. He literally thrived on the fact that everyone around him was focused on him, and he enjoyed it immensely. Then contradictions began to emerge. He started denying everything, then claimed he remembered nothing. Later, he said he had been set up, and that the girls had gone with him willingly. Only after a few days, when investigators began presenting physical evidence, calling witnesses, and showing the locations where bodies were found, did his behavior change dramatically. Psychologists noted the following: this was the moment he realized the game was over. He no longer controlled the situation as he was accustomed to doing. And this is where something happened that continues to spark debate in Brazil to this day. During one of the interrogations, Pereira suddenly began confessing unevenly, illogically, and inconsistently. He didn't describe his crimes directly, but instead narrated scenes as if from his own alternative film, sometimes exaggerating, sometimes pleading facts, and occasionally drifting into fantasy. Investigators later said that distinguishing truth from fiction in his account was extremely difficult. Psychiatrists who worked with him also offered mixed evaluations. Some called him a psychopath with almost complete lack of empathy. Others argued that he suffered from a severe personality disorder with a pathological need to feel power and control over women. But the most terrifying detail for everyone involved: he showed no remorse whatsoever for his actions. Not a single hint of understanding the gravity of his actions. At the same time as the interrogations, another drama unfolded, this one public. The press erupted into a real, chaotic frenzy. Some blamed the police for ignoring the disappearances of young women for so long, treating them as poor girls who had simply gone out for a walk. Others argued that the authorities were afraid to admit that in a metropolis of 20 million people, a serial killer was at work and no one had even suspected it. Relatives of the victims organized protests, demanded transparency in the investigation, and called for the release of accurate numbers. By then, rumors were already circulating that the officially confirmed cases might be far from the only ones, and we know that authorities often prefer to stay silent about such cases or downplay the real number of victims, so as not to incite public panic. But the most shocking moment came during the trial. Pereira behaved provocatively, smiling and occasionally winking at journalists. At one point, he claimed that he had been made into a monster, even though he had only wanted to help the girls, though in ways that no one could understand. This sparked a wave of outrage. Public opinion turned sharply against him. Brazil demanded the maximum punishment. Yet the law was on his side. Somehow, inexplicably, at that time the country had a maximum prison term of 30 years, regardless of the number of crimes or murders committed. This decision shocked many of the victims' relatives. People left the courtroom in disbelief. On the streets, discussions raged over how it was possible that someone who had committed such a series of heinous, grave crimes could be released while still relatively young. And the most terrifying question lingered: what would happen afterward? Would he change? Would he pose a threat to society again? Some serial killers in world history openly admit that they would continue. This case became one of the catalysts for reviewing legislation and introducing stricter measures for especially dangerous offenders. Yet Pereira himself remains a figure that Brazilians prefer to speak of sparingly, not because he has been forgotten, quite the opposite. He serves as a chilling example of how evil can wear the most ordinary face. Sometimes danger does not come from dark alleys, but from the sunlit paths of a big city. And society's vulnerability begins where we stop noticing warning signs. And perhaps the most important lesson, the story of Pereira is a tragic reminder that trust is a weak spot, one that evil often exploits first. In a world where we encounter dozens of new people every day, this lesson resonates louder than ever.